Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College and coming to you with another video with outline and continuing the topic of early childhood, uh, looking at psychological and social development. And so, once again, we're looking at ages 2 through 6 as early childhood. Play turns out to be one of the most productive and enjoyable activities that children undertake during this time period. That's a quote from Invitation from the to the Lifespan by Kathleen Berger, and I think she's completely correct. We might think of other things as being more important than playing, but play is in fact the primary way that children learn and progress in their development at this point. And to indicate how important it is, consider that play is universal. Children everywhere in the world will play if they have the opportunity. And it seems to be hardwired into them. It seems to be just instinctive to engage in play activity at this age. Children don't have to be taught to do it by any means. And in fact, they will if they have the opportunity. So, years ago, one researcher named Mildred Pardon studied children's play and noticed that there was a progression that children tended to follow. The youngest children, around the age of 2, simply engaged in solitary play. And they played alone with a toy or some other object. Um, then, as children got a little bit older, they also engaged in onlooker play. So they would enjoy watching other children playing, even children that were more advanced. And then you saw children begin to engage in parallel play. So what this was is you had uh, two or more children who were doing similar activity at the same time alongside one another. For example, you might have a group of 3 girls who are all coloring, and they're doing the same activity, although they're not interacting in regards to that activity. They're doing it separately. Then, as kids got a little bit older, she observed what was called associative play. So now the children are doing their coloring, but they're also interacting with one another in that play. And they're saying, hey, do you have a red crayon? I need a red crayon. Oh, hey, let me see what you did with that. Oh, here's what I did. Oh, hey, you know what? Let me fill in that part for you. So they're actually working together, and that sort of leads to the most advanced play of cooperative play, as children have some goal to complete together and work together to do so. So, let's build a fort. uh, let's um, let's play this game where we're going to act out a family situation or whatever it is. So very typical. And notice that's a very significant progression in abilities. So play then involves interaction with one's peers being those who are similar to you in age. And peers are the preferred playmates for children in early childhood. Yes, they'll play with older kids, they'll play with adults, but they really prefer other kids their age. Play is important because this enables them to develop social understanding, to understand how other people are going to respond to various things, how other people think, how they feel about things, and how to interact in a way that one can be successful and build relationships. They also learn emotional regulation. And so they learn to control fears and feelings of anger so that they can participate in play with other children. They learn to modulate aggression. Learn to control that aggressive urge that they might have, knowing that if they act on it, the other kids may not want to play with them anymore. And they also learn how to participate in a shared frame of reference. So, a shared frame of reference is an agreement amongst people about how we're going to do things, a set of rules or guidelines that we all adopt together. And so kids learn that by playing, when they set up a game that they're going to play and they decide what are the rules and the boundaries going to be and who gets to take a turn when and all that stuff. They're actually creating this shared frame of reference and then participating in it together. And they're also learning how to establish and maintain relationships, what you should do if you want to have a friend, what you should not do. They're learning communication skills as they communicate to engage other kids in activities, play activities that they might want to do. So, just a tremendous amount going on when kids are playing. So, how kids play is in part influenced by the physical setting of their culture. And so today we see that as more and more children are growing up in urban environments, that is going to be much of the time an indoor environment. And so many people have concerns. Kids are not playing outdoors as much. They don't have as much freedom to go around the neighborhood and play with whoever they might like. So, is this potentially actually stifling their development? Our modern environments like this, electronic media, may be stifling their freedom and creativity that they might otherwise gain in a more free environment or an environment where the game doesn't involve a set um, media approach and so on. And so there may be some truth to that concern. In fact, yes, children may find it more difficult to experience free play. Um, they may find that the games that they're playing don't enable them to create their own rules and so on. But a lot of that just has to do with how it's set up for them. So parents in urban neighborhoods may be afraid to just let their kids run around the neighborhood, but they can set up play dates with other kids and maybe go to the park where they can have a little bit more freedom to run around. In terms of using electronic media like games, well, we can compensate for games maybe squashing creativity by actually focusing on games where kids do create things. There are certain games where they can create their own city or their farm, that sort of thing. And so they can still develop that creativity, even though they may be limited to sitting in front of a computer. So there are some ways we can do that. It takes the adults getting involved to uh, work with the setting that the child has. So one type of play that kids all do is rough and tumble play. So that's that running around, rolling on the ground, wrestling, physical contact, and yeah, kids really love to do this. Yes, it's maybe more favorite of boys, but girls will do it some too. But notice that kids do need certain circumstances to engage in rough and tumble play. First of all, they simply need to have other children there in order to do it. You can't really do that very well alone. You also need somewhere where there's enough room to run around and move around like that. And you maybe need also some situation where there's a little bit of distance between you as a child and the adults, because that can get on the adults' nerves sometimes. But given that situation, kids will spend hours doing this kind of stuff. So, how does this type of play benefit kids? Well, think about it. What are they actually doing? They're developing motor skills. They're developing skills in terms of regulating their emotions. When you play this game, you have to control your emotions as you interact with the other kids. If you get just a little tiny ding, you can't freak out and so on. So you're learning some self-control, and you're learning a lot about how far can you go in interacting with others. So that's really important, you know. So how rough can you get with somebody else before it's not fun anymore? And you learn the limits and the boundaries of what's acceptable through that. Now here's a picture. And so how do we know if this is kids having a fight or if it's rough and tumble play? Well, there's a real easy answer. We can look at their faces, and if everybody's smiling and laughing, having a good time, we've got rough and tumble play here. Now, if anybody's no longer having fun, if somebody's crying or getting hurt, then it's not rough and tumble play anymore. So look at, yeah, the facial expressions give us clues as to what's going on. Now, we also will see social dramatic play. So this is where kids will pick out some particular theme and then create their own drama around that theme. And you've probably done that as a child. Maybe you did things where you played and you played the situation of a family, or maybe you played school with the other kids, and one kid would be the teacher, and everybody else would be the students, and maybe somebody else might be custodian and the cafeteria worker, and you go on, right? And so notice the benefits of social dramatic play are that it works on kids learn how to cooperate to create something together. And it also enables them to engage their creativity and their imagination. It enables them to try out various types of roles that adults might do, and to kind of get a sense of whether they like playing that type of role. And in fact, yeah, I even know, numerous people that they will say the profession that they got into in an adult, well, they really, even as a child, loved to play that part and wanted to do it ever since early childhood. It really does happen. So kids get a lot out of this, and they develop their communication skills too, because a lot of that play in acting out that drama is going to involve actually communicating verbally. And so here we see a typical scene of social dramatic play. And oh, the other thing about it is very inclusive. So almost any child that's around will be roped into the drama and assigned some task, like the little baby here. Maybe he'll be assigned the family dog as his role or something, but they'll get him involved somehow. So also inclusiveness is something that is learned through social dramatic play. So next we go to what in textbooks now is often called caregiving styles. We used to just call this parenting styles, but it's now recognized that often it's others who are caring for the child a great deal of the time. I still often call it parenting styles, but this goes for both parents who care for the child and others. So much of what we'll look at goes back to research by Diane Baumrind, and as she studied parenting, she identified 4 dimensions of parenting that we can look at to then identify various styles of caregiving. The first of these dimensions, nurturance, involves, does that caregiver express warmth, affection for the child? Are they soothing? Are they loving towards the child? Second one is discipline. Is there a discipline strategy? Are there some rules? And are there also consequences to violation of those rules? Is there a plan for this? Thirdly, communication. So communication, could take several forms. Communication could be from parent to child or child to parent, or it could be two-way communication where they can give and take. And then fourthly, you have expectations for maturity. Are the parents' expectations reasonable for the child's age and level of development, or do they expect too much or too little for that child at that particular age? So using these, we can then identify several parenting styles. And so we'll look at the four basic ones and outcomes also that appear in research about these. So the first one on our list is authoritarian parenting. So what's that about? Well, the easiest way to get a handle on this one is to think about an authoritarian government. So, if you know what an authoritarian government, who's the leader when you have an authoritarian government? Oh, the leader is a dictator. Ah, oh, okay. So, how do dictators lead? Well, they make lots of rules, and everybody better follow those rules because if you don't follow the dictator's rules, you're going to have harsh punishment. You're going to receive harsh punishment. Um, does the dictator show lots of affection towards the subjects? Generally, no. Generally, it's all about staying in power and uh, controlling the people that are their subjects, right? It's control and power. And well, what about communication? Can the average person communicate with the dictator and say, I don't like that one rule you made, or I think your punishments are too harsh? No, can't do that. Does the dictator expect their subjects to be mature and be able to make their own decisions? No way. The dictator is going to make all the decisions. So just take all of that and apply it to a household, parents and children. Authoritarian parents, not very nurturing, not very affectionate. Yeah, harsh discipline, lots of rules, and you better not question the rules. Communication, one way from parent to child, and expectations for maturity. In one sense, the authoritarian parent might expect way too much. They might expect a 2-year-old to sit quietly through a 2-hour presentation without budging. It's just not possible for a child that age to do that. So, in that sense, they might expect too much. Now, on the other hand, as kids get older, they might actually expect too little. And when a child gets old enough to begin making some of their own decisions, they don't give them any opportunity to decide anything. They still decide everything for them. So, you have kind of both ends of that not appropriate for the child's age. So, what outcomes do we find with authoritarian parenting? Um, we find that often their children will grow up to be not so happy adults who are often unable to be leaders and only function as followers, who feel powerless to change things in their own lives as well as in their outward environment. That's one of the outcomes you may see. You also may see the outcome of teenage rebellion when you have a very authoritarian parent. When the child gets old enough, they may say, I've had enough of this repression. I'm just going to rebel and I'm going to do what I want now that I'm big enough to actually get away with it. And that puts kids in very dangerous positions sometimes. So we're going to say frequently the outcomes in authoritarian parenting not the best. Now, permissive parenting, the next one on that list, the permissive parent, if you look at textbooks, they disagree because some studies say that the permissive parent is very nurturing, that they want to express lots of affection for their child, and others say no. I kind of, my take on this is that, yeah, that permissive parent might love the child very much and think that the way that they show that love is to let the child just do whatever they want, give them whatever they want. Now, unfortunately, kids often don't see it that way. uh, the child may actually recognize that that they see it as the parent doesn't care about them because they're not protecting them, they're not training them actually to develop some self-control. So kids may not see it as being affectionate. Now, permissive parents, in terms of discipline, generally don't have much of a strategy for discipline. And even if there are some rules, they don't enforce them. Okay, so um, in terms of then communication with the permissive parent, what kind of communication do you get for the most part? Child to parent, the child saying, "Hey, I'm going to do this and give me that." Okay, so it tends to be one way. Expectations for maturity, the permissive parent often has expectations that are too low. And so they don't expect the child to become increasingly capable of controlling themselves and producing what is acceptable. They simply don't work for that. So we'd say, again, not the best. So, how do children of permissive parents tend to do when they grow up? Well, often they have a pretty rough time when they get out into the real world and they find out that there's boundaries, there's guidelines and rules that you have to follow. And if you ignore those, there's consequences to it. Even if you start your own business, well, you still have to pay your taxes and this and that. And they find that to be really shattering when they first begin to encounter all of that. They're not used to that. And they often don't have the self control as well because they haven't been challenged to develop that growing up. So, third on our list is authoritative parenting. Now, this gets confusing for people because it tends to get confused with authoritarian, but it's different. So, authoritative parents, here's how we might think of it. They remain the authority in the home, yet they express lots of affection towards their children. They do have a strategy for discipline. However, the discipline is not particularly harsh. The discipline, uh, if there is a punishment that needs to be given, it's kind of consistent with the offense and the child's temperament. The discipline here is intended to actually help the child learn what is acceptable behavior and to be able to control themselves. So, discipline also is, with authoritative parents, is flexible. So the same rules don't apply entirely all through childhood. They're going to be adjusted as the child becomes more mature. And communication, the authoritative parent encourages communication from their child as well as communicating with them. So what we get here is two-way communication. And the child is even allowed to communicate about the various rules that might be in place or the consequences to violating the rules. The child can say, well, I don't think I need such an early curfew. I should be able to stay out later. And the parent will say, well, let's talk about it, you know. Um, or maybe there's a consequence to a behavior. Child feels it's too harsh. Child is allowed to say, I think that's too harsh. The parent will say, well, let's talk about that. Now, in the end, the parent still remains the authority, and they might adjust the rule, they might adjust the consequence to breaking the rule, or they might keep it the same as is, okay, depending upon what they judge to be most appropriate, but they're at least going to listen, okay. So you get two-way communication, which becomes really important when kids get into their teenage years. In terms of expectations for maturity, um, for authoritative parents, they expect the child to progress in maturity. They recognize that a 2-year-old is still pretty immature, and so there's going to be a limit to the amount of self control that they have and their ability to make decisions. But the authoritative parent is going to work for that child to begin developing more self control and better ability to make their own decisions as they get older, to the point that as they reach the end of their adolescence, the child is able to make many of their decisions on their own eventually. So they are slowly working towards independence with their children. What we find in outcomes with authoritative parenting children from this background tend to be the most adjusted when they reach adulthood, able to be leaders or followers, able to work within structure effectively, mature enough to also have the self control that they need, but also able to speak out when needed as well, also able to express affection for others, including their own children when they get to that point. So generally, they find, at least in our cultural background, that authoritative parenting tends to produce the best outcomes. Now, fourth on our list is neglectful parents. You might also call this the uninvolved parent. So pretty easy to figure out what's going to happen here. Is there nurturance? No, parents not involved. Obviously, that communicates to the child that they just don't care. Is there discipline? No, parents not involved at all. Is there communication? No, although, well, there may be communication eventually. The child might communicate to the parent, and they might cry out for help because the parent is not paying any attention, not is neglecting him, and that happens actually with both children of neglectful as well as permissive parents. And so you may find the child eventually gets to the point where they actually act out to try to get the parent's attention. And so, especially as they get into their teen years, they may do things, get in trouble with the law, maybe abuse drugs, hang out with people that are destructive, things like that, simply to try to get the parents' attention and try to get them involved. Yeah, it actually happens. Neglectful parents also, their expectations for maturity way off. So a neglectful parent might leave a 6-year-old at home with their 3 and 4-year-old brother and sister for a weekend while they go out of town, expecting that 6-year-old to take care of those two younger siblings. Totally inappropriate for the child's age. So you can just guess outcomes with neglectful parenting. Child often is going to get hurt or is going to get into trouble as they get older, and the child is going to need some serious help. So, not recommended, quite obviously. Now, Baumrind's research has been criticized for a number of things. It was done primarily with middle class white families, lacked ethnic diversity, and also overlooked the importance of the child's temperament. So let me talk to you about a couple of those things. Okay. So, first of all, in terms of cultural background and ethnic background, as they began studying this with other groups besides middle class white families, they found that there were some slight differences in outcomes with types of parenting. For example, Black families often leaned somewhat more towards authoritarian parenting, somewhat more. Um, these Black families, though, even being somewhat more authoritarian and having um, some more stiffer rules and harsher punishments, tended to get very good outcomes. Now, recognize that often Black families may be living in neighborhoods where you have um, greater opportunities to run into trouble with the law, including being mistreated sometimes by law enforcement, unfortunately, still happens. Where also there is a greater likelihood that kids might be pressured into criminal activity, where there's more poverty and so forth. And now, of course, not all Black families by any means, but still there's many families that are in those neighborhoods that are like that. And so you might say that authoritarian parenting with a little bit stricter discipline tends to be a bit protective in those kinds of environments. Now, having said that, in these Black families, they were not your classic authoritarian parents because parents actually expressed a great deal of affection and warmth to their children, and they communicated and encouraged their children to communicate with them. And so you saw much more two-way communication, and their expectations for maturity were more appropriate than your typical authoritarian parent. So this worked well under the circumstances that some of them had. So that's one example of how there are some differences in terms of ethnicity and how these parenting styles interact with that. Also, Baumrind didn't really take into account children's temperament. And so the temperament is kind of, are you easygoing or are you high strung? Do you easily get upset? Are you sensitive? Or are you pretty much, you roll with anything and you don't let things bother you and you're kind of fearless? So consider if you've got a child that has kind of a real fearless temperament, well, should you maybe lean a little bit more towards one of these parenting styles with that child? Well, you might have to be a little bit more authoritarian here. That child is totally fearless. You might have to have some stricter rules and maybe a little bit harsher punishment to keep them from hurting themselves, to keep them from getting up on the roof and jumping off or something like that. So there, that might benefit them. On the other hand, if you have a child extremely sensitive, even a mild punishment might be enough to really crush them. And so you might do just fine with a very mild punishment, maybe even just a harsh look. For some kids is enough. For another kid, even a very severe punishment might be not that effective. So temperament is important, and understanding the child's temperament as well. Interestingly, these parenting or caregiving styles even seem to apply when children evaluated their teachers and what type of leadership style their teachers had. They found that where you had teachers that were more authoritative, often this was the case, teachers who were more well educated and prepared for the task of teaching, These teachers tended to be more responsive to children's needs and willing to listen to concerns of children, more flexible in how things were done in the classroom, encouraging dialogue with the children. And these more authoritative teachers were perceived by the children as being more caring, more concerned about the children and their progress. And interestingly, children of these types of teachers tended to learn more. So even here seems to be beneficial to take that approach. Okay, so let's shift to having a look at how children, their parents, and the media interact. So here's the results of a study from a few years ago. We probably need some updating of this, but this shows how many hours of exposure to various video type media, so TV, the internet, that kind of stuff. And you'll notice that, you know, anywhere from 3 to 4.5 hours of media exposure per day in early childhood. That's a lot of time. So, what exactly is the effect of this? Well, consider that if kids are allowed to just access whatever media that they choose, whether that be TV, internet, movies, what have you, they may see violence as being depicted as morally acceptable and the way to solve problems rather than working with people for mutual benefit. They may see high rates of violent crime. Just imagine flipping through various TV channels. You could see hundreds of crimes and murderers in just an hour. So that makes the world look like a much more violent and dangerous place than it actually is. Children who watch more violence, it turned out in studies, actually became more violent over time. So it wasn't that just, kids that were aggressive like violent entertainment, but if you took kids and exposed them to more violent material, they tended to become more aggressive as well. So we know this is a cause and effect sort of thing. And as kids just randomly access media, they may encounter all sorts of racial and gender stereotypes still being promoted in much of that material that they access. So, as you look at this, it obviously indicates that that's not the most beneficial way for kids to engage with media. Now, on the other hand, they have found that children who were spent considerable time watching educational television programs actually benefited from that. Even as teenagers, they did better in school. They scored higher on reading and literacy. And so, yes, educational TV, positive effects, but random media use, not so beneficial. So, groups that advocate for children recommend that we should limit children's media use, especially before age 2, to not so many hours a day, first of all, because they really need to be interacting with others. And also that we should spend more time playing and talking with them and actually interacting. So that does put some responsibility on the part of adults and parents that are around to actually do that. So when it comes to family time, consider that there have been some studies that parents, on average, spend only a few minutes of direct communication with their children per day. That's really scary. It's staggering if you look at the actual statistics on this. Very little time. Now, consider if the child is watching hours of video, internet, social media, as opposed to only a few minutes of direct communication with their parents. Well, who's good? Which is going to have greater influence? Obviously, the parental influence is going to be less if they're spending all this time with that media. And so, again, is that what we want? Also consider that most media usage is solitary, non-interactive. And so, mm, if there's meals in the family, if family gets together for meals, is the TV on? Think about that. So, actually, as adults get more involved in interacting with media on their phones and so on, we're having less communication with their children. And so that's a concern. So that's one of the things I think we ought to really pick up on. Yeah, if we can, we ought to have family meals so that everybody has a chance to check in with one another and talk about things. Parents have an opportunity to find out where kids need their help and so on. Um, Very important. And when we're having those times, it's important to put the phone down, turn the TV off, and actually concentrate on interacting. And notice that, yeah, kids need this interaction for their language development, emotional development. They need that interaction. Um, so for parents, um, it's important that parents set the example and limit their own use of media as well. And then find ways to limit their children's exposure in terms of how much time they're spending on that, as well as the content that they're accessing. And if you take away all of that, you have to replace it with something. So we need to also make an effort to engage children's interest in other activities so that they try other things and develop their abilities rather than simply spending all their time on that media. So this again requires that we adults make an effort for our children. So let's go on to the topic of child discipline. So, generally, the goal of child discipline is to help guide children towards beneficial behavior, help them to learn and internalize standards of morality. Discipline is most effective if it comes from a place of affection for the child, it comes from caring for the child, and also from a place of secure attachment, of a secure bond between that parent and child. Now, acceptable behavior varies by culture, so just what behaviors are taught through child discipline is going to vary. Here's some things that they have found that effective parents do when it comes to child discipline. And I think the first one is, again, expressing that affection for the child. Um, uh, Now, also, effective parents may prevent misbehavior and arrange the environment simply to prevent that in some cases. So, especially with the youngest children who may not be able to control their impulses, if they put things away that the child's not supposed to be getting into, that's going to prevent a lot of problems. Also, parents who were effective used reinforcement and shaping to modify the child's behavior. So, reinforcement, when the child is doing the desirable thing, there's sort of a payoff for that, you know? And I think that's one of the things that really, yeah, uh, ineffective is, yeah, oh, everything's based on punishment. And when you do things right, there's nothing good happens. So using reinforcement, really beneficial. Shaping, so recognizing that the child is not going to be able to grasp all of the aspects of a task immediately, but rather they need to learn it step by step and receive some reinforcement and reassurance as they're learning to do various tasks. Also, parents who are effective set the example. and they make age-appropriate demands that the child is actually capable of responding to. So, when engaging in discipline with children, we need to also remember some of the limitations that they have in early childhood. For example, the youngest children do not have theory of mind. They don't understand that other people think differently, feel differently than they do. That develops gradually. So we need to encourage them to develop empathy and that theory of mind so they will understand how people feel. And we can do that. We say, you know, if someone did that to you, how would you feel? And get them to think about that. Um, we also need to remember that their self concept is emerging, especially early on when they begin getting that sense of self that we talked about earlier. When they first begin to learn that they're a separate person who can have their own things, sharing may be more difficult. And so we may have to have a few things that the child can have as just their own, but then other things we need to help them to learn how to share. We also should remember fast mapping. Now, what's that? Fast mapping is where you hear some new word, some new phrase, and you kind of get a sense of what it is, but you don't completely understand it. So kids just get a quick understanding of something. Um, this goes along with, yes, young children can say and hear more than they really understand. So they might hear somebody saying a dirty word, and they might pick this up thinking that, well, this is an expression you say when you're angry, but not knowing that it's inappropriate. Or they might not fully understand what certain words and concepts are. So explanation, discussion before and after misbehavior might help children learn. I can give you an example here that's actually happened with my niece when she was early childhood. I guess she was about 3. Um, and so my brother's looking for some of his things around the house, can't find them. Finally, he finds them under Kirsten's bed. And so he says to her, well, Kirsten, why do you have my things over here under your bed? And she says, oh, Dad, we're learning about sharing. So here's an example of fast mapping. She heard about sharing, that you are using other people's things. And so she thought, this is sharing. You just take people's things and use them. Well, so he then went on to explain to her, well, what sharing is, you ask the person first if you can use that. You ask them if you can have it before you just take it. Oh, now imagine if instead he had simply proceeded to immediately punish her harshly. Obviously would not have been appropriate. So that's always important to remember. They may not understand about that misbehavior. You have to make sure they understand it. And for that matter, realizing that young children are not yet able to use logic. So if we punish them for misbehavior, they may not automatically connect that punishment with what they did wrong. So we have to explain that to them so they understand why the punishment is occurring. Okay, so those are some developmental things that we need to keep in mind with kids this age of discipline. So, what about physical punishment for kids this age? Um, the research indicates that it is true that physical punishment will temporarily increase obedience. That is true. However, what we also know from the research is that the use of physical punishment to discipline children also correlates with them later engaging in aggressive behavior towards others, more likely to become bullies, to engage in delinquent law breaking behavior when they become older, or potentially become abusive parents, even if the physical punishment was not abusive that they received. So we ought to think twice about that before using any physical punishment. Also, physical punishment may teach the child that might makes right. So if I'm strong enough to make you do what I want, that makes it okay. And maybe that's not what we want to teach them. And so when we're talking about physical punishment, we're not talking about abuse necessarily. It might be a spanking that is not abuse per se. And that said, we again might want to think twice because of the potential negatives. Um, Now, in fact, yes, many of us that received spankings as children didn't become violent adults. There's other factors like an environment of poverty or temperamental factors that are actually stronger influence. But still, yeah, we want to think twice. And here's something, I should have this on the slide here, is often other forms of discipline turn out to be even more effective. So, actually taking away a privilege, they found to be more effective than producing a physical punishment. Other methods of modifying behavior also, and recognizing that physical punishment, it may stop the child from doing something, but it doesn't teach them what they should do. So all of that comes into play. Now, cultural differences also come into play. In some cultures, physical punishment is expected, and it maybe is somewhat less detrimental under those circumstances than in cultural groups where it is taboo. There, it tends to be even more detrimental. So think twice before engaging in that. There are many better ways to get good outcomes. So, other forms of discipline that can be effective, psychological control. Now, this one. So, the parent then threatens the withdrawal of love and support to the child for misbehavior or relies on guilt on the child's part, feeling guilty to motivate good behavior. Is this a desirable way of um, modifying the child's behavior? Not particularly. This can cause the child to begin feeling insecure that maybe you don't love them and can undermine their self esteem, can make them conclude that they're not just guilty, but a bad person. And of course, if you're a bad person, what kind of behaviors are you going to produce? Well, bad behaviors. Um, they also found that when parents relied heavily on psychological control, children were more likely to engage in relational aggression. In other words, spreading rumors to harm other children or to insult other children and so forth. Children are also more likely to become depressed or having difficulty with anxiety, obviously. This is not the best way to go either. Now, that said, the effect does vary by culture. For example, in Japanese culture, this is one of the primary means of modifying a child's behavior, relationships being very important in that culture. But for most of us, this is probably going to not be the best way to go. What about the use of timeouts? Now, probably all of you know about timeouts. Child misbehaves and then they have to sit quietly away from anything that's rewarding, no toys to play with, no one to play with, can't play with their playmates, and so on. Is this effective? Yes, with most children, this will be effective if it is done consistently each time the misbehavior and if it's done for an appropriate amount of time. Now, surprisingly, the amount of time necessary varies by age and is surprising to people. They found out that roughly 1 minute of time out per year of the child's age was about the most that was going to be effective. So if you have a 4-year-old, 4 minutes of timeout was the greatest effective dose. 6 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour was no more effective than 4 minutes done each time the misbehavior occurs. So can be effective. That said, there are a few kids that this is not effective with. If you happen to have a child that tends to be very introverted, yeah, they may prefer actually being off to themselves rather than interacting with the other kids. But for most kids, yeah, it can be effective. Time in. Now, here's one that actually I was using before I knew it was what it was called, with my son particularly. And so the child misbehaves, they are removed from that situation, and then the child must have a conversation about that misbehavior. Now, the parent's explanation must be age appropriate. And so the parent discusses with the child what brought on the misbehavior, um, could have been some other more appropriate ways to behave, responses, and so on. That actually can be quite effective. In fact, with my son, uh, when I would use this, a lot of times he would say, "Well, instead of sitting here talking with you about it, can you just give me a punishment?" You know, and so yeah, it wasn't very pleasant, but yet it did seem to have a very significant effect with him. And one of the things they found with using this approach is that it promotes moral development in terms of what is right and wrong, appropriate or not, more effectively than just a timeout. So might be one to consider. Then we also list in the textbook induction, which is what explaining and reasoning with the child, helping them verbalize the emotion that brought on misbehavior and how to seek a better way to handle that situation. They found this does help the child develop empathy, internalize the standards of behavior. So that is effective, although it depends on the child's age. This is going to be more effective with a older child than a younger child. The younger child may not be able to follow the reasoning behind all of that. Older children may benefit. Okay, there's some ideas on that. So let's move on to the topic of child maltreatment. So this would involve any intentional harm that is meted out to a child, avoidable endangerment, as well as neglect. Child abuse being when a person deliberately acts in order to harm a child physically, emotionally, or sexually. So when we look at child maltreatment, there are significant differences between the cases of maltreatment that is reported and substantiated. So, in fact, we may find that the reports about abuse, um, the numbers of substantiated abuse cases has decreased, but the number of cases involving neglect has increased in recent years. Also, many believe that the amount of child maltreatment that's reported and substantiated is just the tip of the iceberg. For every case that's reported, there's probably several that go unreported. And amongst those that are reported, there may be numerous ones that cannot be substantiated, but yet the abuse may be actually occurring. So, given that, know that here in Texas, all our citizens have a duty to report abuse or suspected abuse. So everyone, it's not just teachers, not just doctors and medical personnel, psychologists, but every Texan is required to report abuse if they observe it or if they suspect it. So you might say, well, if this happens, how do I report it? It depends. Okay, so if the abuse is occurring as in progress right now, or if it involves an emergency, such as a medical emergency, um, three numbers, 911, call 911. Okay, so that's the very first most important thing to know. Now, if the abuse is not happening at this moment, or if it is simply suspected, one can call Child Protective Services and report the abuse that has occurred or that is suspected. A third avenue then, and this is once again, if this is not currently in progress, or if it's not an immediate emergency, is one can report by calling the Texas Abuse Hotline. Or actually, the Abuse Hotline also enables you to also to type in the report of suspected abuse. So you see the number on your screen, but if you don't have that available when you need it, you can just go and Google Texas Abuse Hotline. I think you can remember that, and it will come up on your screen. As a matter of fact, see if I can bring it up here real quick, and you can see what the website looks like. Okay, so what you find here on the Abuse Hotline, you can report child maltreatment as well as any kind of abuse, whether it's elder abuse, whether it's domestic violence, that type of abuse, any type. At this website, you can do it by calling the number or typing in a report. You can do this anonymously if you prefer. Now, I would suggest if you can safely leave your name, that it's best to do so, because that can make the investigation of the abuse, can expedite it. But if it's a situation where maybe you would be endangered by providing your name, you don't have to. You can be anonymous. Now, if you report this anonymously, it still keeps a record that you reported it. So if later on it comes up that you should have known about the abuse and should have reported it, you can actually prove that you did report it, even though you reported it anonymously. I know that's confusing, but take my word for it. Okay. All right. So that's how the website looks like. What it looks like. Okay. So let's go back to our outline. Okay. So what things might suggest child maltreatment? Now, obviously, if you see it occurring, that's quite obvious. Okay. That said, sometimes you may not directly see it. But if you find that the child has injuries that don't fit an accidental explanation, you know, if the child's injuries are not consistent with the story that's being given about, how the injuries occurred, that could potentially indicate abuse. If the child suffers from repeated injuries, frequent injuries, especially things like broken bones that were not properly tended. Let's say that you're in a medical capacity and you see on x-rays that the child has actually numerous broken bones, not properly treated. That might bring reasonable suspicion of abuse. Also, if the child engages in fantasy play that involve dominant themes of violence or indicate sexual knowledge that would not be typical of children that age. And so that again, if that doesn't seem right for a child that age, also slowed physical growth. It's a child unusually small for their age, particularly if you find the child has an unusual appetite. They're constantly famished, or if they lack appetite, you say, what about lack of appetite? How would that be involved with abuse? Well, in fact, the stress of being abused may destroy the child's appetite. Um, Ongoing physical complaints that are not immediately or not directly observable. Things like frequent complaints of stomach ache, headaches, genital pain, sleepiness. So, a couple reasons that these might be indicators. In some cases, these actually are real physically for the child, and they are brought on by the stress of the abuse, or they're consistent with the type of abuse. In the case of genital pain, may actually be because of damage to the child's genitals with sexual abuse. On the other hand, sometimes these may be not actual things the child's experiencing, but the child may use these as a way of escaping situations where they might experience the abuse. And so, if they can stay away from uh, going to grandma's house where the abuse is happening, by saying that, well, I've got a bad stomach ache, and can I stay home? I don't want to go there. Sometimes that's also what's going on. By the way, I should notice that sometimes one of these alone may not be enough by itself to suspect abuse, although sometimes by itself it might be. In some cases, though, when you see a number of these things together, this might actually raise your suspicion of abuse. So, where you see more than one of these things going on, your suspicion should be heightened. Here's another: reluctance to talk, play, or move around. Okay, and you say, well, why that? Okay, so the child may have been threatened by the abuser to not interact with other adults, or to interact with other children for fear that the abuse may be discovered, that the child might let on the abuse is occurring. And sometimes, too, the child just may not feel like playing because, again, the stress of the abuse. Um, the child who has no close friendships, hostile to other children, or bullies other children as well. No close friendships, they may not feel like interacting with the other kids, or they may have been threatened by the abuser to avoid other kids. Hostility and bullying of others can be a way of feeling more powerful when being abused themselves. Hypervigilance. So the child may cringe, startle to things that normally would not startle children, or may actually hit when startled. That sort of thing. Um, for example, maybe you just move your hand, and the child begins ducking and cringing. Yeah, that's not normal, right? And so they may be expecting what came to them from the abuser. Frequent absences from school. So the abuser may keep the child away from school so that no one notices the abuse. If there's bruises and cuts and so forth. Um, Frequent changes of address. So where does that come into play? The abuser may move residence frequently in order to stay ahead of any authorities that might be investigating the abuse. And sad to say, abuse is also more common in cases of low income where people might have to move more frequently, but that in and of itself should not be an indicator. Um, Turnover in caregivers that come to pick up the child, caregiver that comes late or seems to be high. Yeah, so they if they constantly someone else coming to pick up the child, it's not a very stable home situation or family situation. Caregiver comes late. They may have some other problems, drug abuse problems, and so on. Obviously, neglecting the child by not coming when they have should be, and fear that is expressed when they see the caregiver rather than joy as well, obviously, again. So, again, you might find that suspicion of abuse involves simply one of these things that is so drastic that it raises suspicion of abuse. In other cases, it may be a pattern of several things, but if any rate you suspect that abuse, report it. Okay, so what are the consequences of child maltreatment? Abuse is always destructive, so no question about it. Possible effects include physical damage to the child's body, also academic impairment. So the child cannot concentrate in school or is missing school. The child is unable to feel safe around adults who they should be able to trust. They uh, develop suspicion of others. This may even go on even into adulthood, and they may have trouble forming good, normal, trusting relationships with others, even into adulthood. Also, isolation, including a lack of friends. These individuals then are more likely as adults to have problems with drug abuse, non-supportive relationships, including abusive relationships, more likely to experience eating disorders and become either a victim or aggressor towards others, engage in self-destructive acts, including suicide, develop emotional problems like depression and anxiety disorders. Um, I'm just, yes, it is true that problems as adults uh, tend to be more severe impairments amongst women than men, but I really think that the difference is so slight that I probably ought to take that off of there. So I'd say don't pay so much attention to that. But you got a whole bunch of very negative consequences here. So obviously, we've got to take this seriously and do what we can to prevent or minimize the damage that occurs as a result. So, in terms of intervention, um, primary intervention involves uh, prevention of maltreatment. So, what some of the things can help is family, neighborhood, and income stability. So, if we have families that are stable, it's less likely to occur than if we have an unstable family where maybe we have one parent who is with the child, and then you have various boyfriends and girlfriends that come and go. Uh, Not as safe, obviously, a stable family. Also, stable neighborhoods. They say, well, where's that come in mind? We have a stable neighborhood. People get to know their neighbors, and there is a greater likelihood that they're going to notice if there's something wrong, and or if that neighbor needs help in terms of parenting, more likely to be available to help. So that's important. Income stability as well. When parents are stressed due to lack of income, unemployment, yeah, abuse is more likely to occur under situations of stress like that. Also, discouraging teen parenthood. They found that young teens, particularly that have children, are more likely to become abusive, and that's in great extent due to simply being not as mature yet. Our frontal cortex doesn't fully develop until we get into our mid 20s, so that impulse control is not fully there yet. And also, that it's really difficult in many cases to be a teen parent. You don't have the resources, you don't have the support of others often in that case, and so being more stressful, abuse becomes more likely. So if we can just get teens to just hold off in having children until they get a little bit older, we're actually going to prevent a lot of abuse. Um, Secondary intervention would be to notice warning signs of abuse and intervene at that point. If it has not occurred already, we may be able to head it off. So, some things that might benefit here would be home visits to high risk homes where there's a high risk of abuse. by specially trained nurses or social workers. They can work with parents to help them learn to parent effectively, to maybe identify resources that that parent might need so that the abuse doesn't occur. Parental education as well. When parents know what they're doing, it's less likely to happen, as well as support for parents, high quality daycare, so that when the parent needs some help in caring for the child, it's available. So that prevents neglect, also may prevent abuse due to too much stress on the parent's part and not an opportunity for a bit of relief from child care. So a whole bunch of stuff there. Now, at the tertiary level, um, if abuse has occurred, we need to do what we can to reduce the harm that comes from that maltreatment. So, making sure that any medical treatment and mental health treatment that the child needs is provided them. Now, this also may involve providing help that the parent needs. If the courts deem that the child can stay with that parent though may need assistance in terms of rehabilitation for drug abuse problems. They might need help in terms of resources. They might need help in terms of employment and income. That parent may need help with emotional problems and psychotherapy or medication, things like that. So we need to make sure that that side of it is attended to as well as the child's needs. If it is deemed that the child must be in another home, then we need to work for the child's best interest. Now, sometimes then what will be provided will be kinship care. So the child may be placed with relatives, but that's not always the best situation. There may not be a suitable relative capable of caring for that child, or there may be relational problems that occur that prevent uh, qualified relatives for caring for the child. But where that is possible, that might be one good option. So if the child then needs to be placed in foster care, then we need to also engage in permanency planning. We need to place them with a family that is likely to be able to care for that child long term rather than just temporarily. So trying to place them with a similar family in terms of that. Also, if there are siblings, other brothers or sisters that need to be placed, keeping them together with that child is important as well. So the bottom line is that judges, social workers, doctors, psychologists, all those involved with the care of children that have been maltreated need to work together to make the system work effectively for them. So there you go. Um, Sorry to end on kind of an unpleasant note in this chapter, but it is important to know about this and to know what to do should you encounter that in your experience. So have a great day, and we'll move on to another chapter and more topics.